He was 11 years old. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and he looked at me, not like a child looks at his mother, but like someone who had seen something I hadn't. And he said, "Mama, demons don't fear the cross on the wall. They fear the cross that lives inside the person." I put down my cup. I didn't know what to say. He was only 11, but in that moment, he did not sound like a child. We had just finished dinner. The plates were still on the table. The kitchen light was warm and low, the way it always was in the evening, and I remember there was a quiet that had settled over the apartment, the kind of quiet that only comes after a long day, when the city outside finally softens and everything slows down. Carlo was sitting across from me. He had his hands folded on the table. He wasn't playing. He wasn't distracted. He was just looking at me, quietly. With that expression he sometimes had, the one I never quite knew how to describe. Not serious exactly, not solemn, just aware. Like he was seeing something I hadn't noticed yet. I asked him what he was thinking about. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Mama, demons don't fear the cross on the wall. They fear the cross that lives inside the person." I put down my cup. I didn't laugh. I didn't dismiss it. Something in the way he said it made that impossible. I just sat there, looking at my 11-year-old son, and I felt something shift inside me. Something that felt less like surprise and more like recognition. Like hearing a truth you had always sensed but never been able to say. I wish I could tell you I responded with wisdom. I didn't. I think I asked him where he had heard that. He looked at me gently and said, "I didn't hear it anywhere. I just know it." And there was no pride in his voice when he said it. Somehow, that unsettled me even more. That was Carlo. And I remember thinking, in that quiet kitchen with the city humming outside, that I had just heard something I was not prepared for. Something that would take me years to fully understand. I want to be honest with you about who I was at that time, because I think it matters. I was not a bad woman. I was not someone who had abandoned faith. I went to Mass. I had a crucifix in the house. I believed in God in the way that many people believe, sincerely, but from a distance. Faith was something I carried, but I am not sure it was something that had truly entered me. Not yet. Carlo knew this, not in a way that made him unkind. He was never unkind. But he saw clearly, and he loved clearly, and sometimes love that sees clearly is the most unsettling kind. What I'm going to share with you in this video, these conversations, these moments, these things my son said in the quietest corners of ordinary days, they changed me. Not all at once. Some of them I only began to understand years after he was gone. Some of them I am still learning to understand now. But I believe they were not meant only for me. I believe Carlo said these things because there are souls who need to hear them. Souls who are carrying crosses on their walls, but not yet in their hearts. Souls who are asking why the darkness doesn't seem to leave their homes, their families, their minds, even when they pray, even when they try. Souls who feel, as I once felt, that something is missing, but cannot say what. If that is you, stay with me. Because what my son understood, even as a child, about what darkness truly fears may explain more about your home and your prayer life than anything I had understood as an adult. Let me take you back to that kitchen. It was a Tuesday evening in Milan, late autumn, I think, because I remember the windows were dark early, and there was that particular cold that comes into Italian apartments before the heating has properly begun. Carlo had been to Mass that morning. He went every morning, if you didn't know that about him. every single morning. Not because we required it, not because it was a rule in our home. He required it of himself. He was the one who woke early. He was the one who was already dressed and waiting while the rest of us were still finding our way to consciousness. He was not a joyless child, quite the opposite. He laughed easily. He had friends. He loved technology and football and animals. He was fully present in the world, more present than most adults I have known. And yet there was this center in him, this still place, that everything else seemed to orbit around. The Mass was not a detour from his real life. It was the source of it. That evening, after his words about the cross on the wall, I asked him what he meant. He thought for a moment. Carlo always thought before he spoke, which is not something you often see in children or in adults either. And then he said, "When a demon sees a cross on the wall, it sees an object. But when it looks at a soul in a state of grace, it sees him. And that is what it cannot bear." I remember the stillness in the room. I remember thinking, where does an 11-year-old find these words? Where does a child reach into the invisible and pull out something so precise? He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress me. He was simply telling me what he knew. The way you tell someone that the sky is gray or that the water is cold, with that same calm certainty. He wasn't teaching me theology. He was teaching me something far more intimate. The protection I was looking for, the protection every mother looks for her home and her children and herself, it doesn't come from the outside in. It comes from the inside out. A cross on the wall is a declaration, but a soul in a state of grace is a presence. Presence changes the spiritual atmosphere of a place. Carlo knew that. And I wonder sometimes, if someone walked into your home today, would they feel that presence? If you were to be honest with yourself right now, completely honest, would you say that the crosses and the saints' images and the holy water by the door of your home represent something living inside you? Or have they become, over time, a kind of decoration? Things you keep because you were raised to keep them, but that no longer cost you anything. He never made me feel ashamed, but he made me want to be more. That was his gift. He made the people around him want to be more. Not out of guilt, but out of something more like desire. Like catching a glimpse of a fire and suddenly feeling how cold you have been. But that conversation at the kitchen table was not the only moment when Carlo said something that unsettled me. A few weeks later, something happened after Sunday Mass that made those first words even harder to ignore. We had returned from Mass together, the whole family, and we were walking home through the streets near our apartment. The bells had just finished ringing. The sidewalks were still wet from the morning cleaning the city workers always did on Sundays. It was one of those rare Milan mornings when the light has a particular quality, golden and unhurried, the kind that makes the city look like a painting of itself. Carlo was walking beside me. He had received communion that morning as always, and there was something about him in those moments, after the Eucharist, that I can only describe as settled. Not quiet exactly, not withdrawn, but settled, the way a room feels after it has been cleaned. A sense of order that came from somewhere beyond the visible. He said to me, without preamble, without introduction, "Mama, do you know what happens to a home when someone inside it receives Jesus every day?" I said I supposed it became a holy place. He shook his head, not to correct me, but to take me deeper. It becomes a place where he already is. The person carries him back, and where Jesus is truly present, in a soul, everything around that soul is changed. The home is changed. The air is changed, not because of a blessing or a prayer, because he is there." He paused and then added something I have never forgotten. "Demons don't just avoid holy places, Mama. They avoid holy people. Because a holy person doesn't just pray, they bring the answer to the prayer with them wherever they go." I stopped walking. I actually stopped in the middle of the street and looked at him. He looked back at me with that expression, patient, warm, entirely serious. At the time, I thought it was only a beautiful thought. Because if what he was saying was true, then holiness was not something distant and decorative. It was something that could walk through the front door of a house. And I had to ask myself whether I had really been living as if that were true. I would later realize it was much more than that. The Eucharist was everything to Carlo. He once told me that the saddest thing he could imagine was a Catholic who stopped going to Mass and didn't feel the loss. Because it means they never really understood what they were receiving. It means they thought it was a symbol. And you don't miss a symbol the way you miss a person. He knew, with a certainty I have rarely seen in anyone, that Jesus in the Eucharist was not a memorial, was not a ritual, was not a spiritual exercise, was a person, was the person, and that receiving him was the single most transformative thing a human being could do with their body and their soul. Carlo didn't go to Mass every morning because he was unusually holy. He went because he was unusually awake. He saw clearly what was at stake, and once you see clearly, you cannot choose otherwise. That was the cross inside the person he had spoken about that first night at the kitchen table. Not an object, a presence, a living reality carried back from the altar into the home. I thought that was the deepest thing he would say to me about spiritual protection. It wasn't. There is something I need to tell you about myself that I did not fully understand until Carlo helped me see it. I prayed. I was not someone who neglected prayer. I said my rosary. I made my intentions. I asked God for protection over my family, over my home, over my children. I did what I had been taught to do, and I did it faithfully, in the way that you do something faithfully when it has become part of the rhythm of your days. But Carlo said something to me once that stopped that rhythm entirely. We were sitting in the small chapel near our home, one of those quiet weekday afternoons when the church was nearly empty and the candles were the only movement in the room. We sat side by side in the wooden pew, and after a long silence, he said very quietly, almost to himself, "Mama, I think some prayers are very loud and very empty at the same time." I turned to look at him. It took me years to fully understand that sentence. He kept his eyes forward, toward the tabernacle. But he continued, "When we pray but don't want to change, when we ask God for protection but we aren't willing to give him what is blocking the protection, the prayer goes up, but it doesn't open anything. It's like knocking on a door and then turning away before it can open." I felt something tighten in my chest. I recognized in those words something I had never been willing to name. A pattern in my own prayer life that I had sensed but never confronted. The pattern of asking God to change my circumstances while quietly, stubbornly, holding on to the interior habits that were producing those circumstances. Carlo wasn't scolding me. His voice was tender. But truth doesn't require a harsh voice to land with full force. He explained it further with an image. Think of a house with all the windows closed. Someone outside is trying to bring in light and fresh air. They have everything needed, but the windows are shut. And the person inside keeps asking why it's still dark. God doesn't force the window. He waits with so much love, so much patience, but the darkness stays as long as the window stays closed. I asked him what the closed window was. It's different for every person, but usually it is the thing they are least willing to look at. The resentment they have carried so long it feels like part of them. The wound they would rather protect than heal. The unforgiveness they have given a comfortable chair in their heart. He looked at me then. Whatever it is, that is what the enemy holds on to. Not because he is powerful, but because we handed it to him and never asked for it back. That was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. I had been praying for protection, while quietly protecting the very things that were keeping the darkness inside. I want to ask you something, and I want you to take a moment before you answer it. Is there something in you right now, something you already know the name of, that you have not yet handed back? The enemy does not need great power to maintain a foothold in a home or in a soul. He only needs an invitation that was never fully revoked, a wound that was never fully surrendered, a habit that was never fully named. That is his foothold. Not the absence of crucifixes, the interior space that was offered and never reclaimed. This was the third thing Carlo tried to give me. And I will be honest with you, it was the hardest one to receive. Because it required me to stop looking outside myself for the source of the darkness I sometimes felt, and to begin looking within. And that is never a comfortable direction to look. But Carlo was not finished. What he said later that same week unsettled me even more. There was an evening, I think Carlo was 12, perhaps almost 13, when we had a conversation that went even deeper. It was late. He should have been asleep. I found him in the living room, sitting in the dark near the window, looking out at the city lights. I asked him what he was doing awake. He said he had been thinking. I sat down beside him, and after a moment he said, "Mama, do you know what opens the door to the darkness more than anything else?" I said I didn't know. "Pride," he said simply. "Not the obvious kind, not arrogance, the quiet kind, the kind that says, I can manage this. I don't need to ask. I am handling it." He turned from the window to look at me. The moment a person thinks they are strong enough on their own, that is the moment they become most vulnerable, because they stopped asking for help, and the enemy knows exactly when that happens. I remember sitting very still after he said that, because he wasn't describing a stranger. What Carlo was describing did not sound like the pride of a vain or boastful person. He was describing something much more subtle, much more ordinary, the kind of pride that lives quietly inside a responsible person, a capable person, someone who keeps things together and rarely asks for help, because asking for help feels like weakness, and weakness feels like failure. That was me in many ways. I was a woman who managed, who kept things moving, who prayed, yes, but who also, underneath the prayer, retained a fundamental confidence in her own capacity to navigate life. I brought my needs to God, but I also, if I am honest, maintained a quiet backup plan, just in case. Carlo saw this, not with judgment, but with clarity. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's knowing that everything good in you came from somewhere else, and staying close to that source. Because the moment you walk away, even just a little, the light dims. And in the dim, things move that can't move in the light. Things move that can't move in the light. And in that moment, I realized something unsettling. Much of the enemy's work depends on keeping the soul dim enough not to notice what has entered. I remember looking at the city outside the window after he said that. all those thousands of lit windows and all those thousands of dark spaces between them. And I thought about how much of my interior life I had kept unlit, not out of malice, but out of that quiet, confident, self-sufficient pride that had never quite learned to say, I cannot do this alone. I need you, not as a last resort, as a first step, as a permanent posture. Carlo had a particular devotion to his guardian angel. The way he spoke about his angel was not sentimental, it was precise. He told me once that his guardian angel was the most constant companion he had, after Jesus. He spoke to his angel the way you speak to someone walking beside you on a quiet road, naturally, as if ignoring him would have been the strange thing, without performance, without ceremony. I asked him once why he seemed so aware of his angel when most people, even devout people, rarely thought about theirs. Because most people don't believe their angel is really there. They believe it theoretically. But if you truly believe someone is walking with you, really present beside you, you talk to them. You don't ignore someone who loves you and is right there. Guardian angels become more active the more you rely on God and less on yourself. It's not that they do more, it's that you finally let them. Pride closes that too, Mama. Pride says, I see the road fine on my own, and so you walk alone. Even when someone is right there, ready to guide you, and has been the whole time, Carlo reached out, constantly, to Jesus in the Eucharist, to Our Lady, to his guardian angel, to the saints. He built his life on relationship, real, living, daily relationship with the invisible world. And because of that, he moved through the visible world with a freedom I have never seen in anyone else. A lightness, a lack of fear. He was not naive. He knew more about the reality of evil than most adults I have known. But he was not afraid, because he had simply, completely given himself over to a protection he trusted entirely. Humility had opened that door for him. The daily surrender of self-sufficiency. The daily choice to say, I am not enough on my own, and I do not need to be because I am not alone. And I remember thinking, if what he was saying was true, then much of my own life had been lived with the windows half closed, not because I didn't believe, but because believing and surrendering are not the same thing. And I had spent years doing one while quietly resisting the other. I thought I had understood everything he was trying to show me. Then we walked past a church one afternoon, and he stopped. There is a sacrament that Carlos spoke about with a particular kind of urgency. Not the urgency of fear, not the urgency of obligation, but the urgency of someone who understood, with unusual clarity, what was actually happening in that small wooden confessional. What was being moved, what was being removed, what was being restored, and could not quite comprehend why more people didn't run toward it. He was around 12 when he said to me one afternoon, quite suddenly, as we were walking past our parish church, Mama, confession is the most misunderstood sacrament there is. I asked him why he thought that. He stopped walking. He looked at the church door for a moment and then turned to me and said, People think it's about guilt, about listing sins and feeling better. And the forgiveness is real, completely real. But that's not the deepest thing that happens. The deepest thing is that it removes permission. I remember feeling almost exposed when he said that. Not condemned, exposed, as though he had quietly named something I had sensed for years, but had never dared to look at directly. I didn't understand immediately. I asked him what he meant. When we sin and don't confess it, it's like an open wound, and an open wound attracts things. The enemy doesn't create the wound, but he uses it. He reaches into it. He whispers into it. As long as it stays unconfessed, he has access. Not because he earned it, because we left the door open. Confession closes the door. It doesn't just forgive. It removes the access. It takes back what was handed over, and the enemy knows that, which is why he works so hard to keep people away from it. He makes them feel too ashamed to go, too convinced that their sins are too small to bother with or too large to be forgiven. Either extreme keeps them outside the confessional, and outside the confessional, the wound stays open. It was the first time confession sounded to me less like obligation and more like rescue. Carlo was describing something I had never quite heard articulated that way. Not as a religious duty, not as a moral accounting, but as a spiritual surgery. The literal removal of something that did not belong, that had been given access through sin and could only be evicted through the sacrament. He made it sound urgent in the way that treating an infection is urgent. Not dramatic, not frightening, simply necessary. Don't let things accumulate, he told me once. In the soul, like in a house, the longer you wait to clean, the harder it becomes. And the harder it becomes, the less you want to do it. And the less you want to do it, the more convincing the voice becomes that says you don't need to. He said that voice, the one that talks you out of confession, that finds reasons, that manufactures delays, was one of the enemy's most effective tools. Because it required no dramatic intervention, just patience, just small discouragements, just the steady erosion of the habit. If you are someone who has been away from confession, for months, for years, I want you to hear this not as an accusation, but as an invitation. The door is open. It has always been open. The priest in that confessional is not there to assess you or to measure the weight of what you carry. He is there to close a wound, to restore something, to remove what has had access that it was never meant to have. That, Carlo taught me, is how the cross inside the person stays clean, how it stays luminous, how it stays the thing the enemy cannot bear to look at. Now I need to tell you about the conversation that changed me most. Carlo had been placing small stones in my heart for years, one conversation at a time, one quiet truth after another, in kitchens and chapels and late evening rooms, along Sunday sidewalks still wet from morning, in the dark, beside a window full of city lights. And that evening, a quiet Sunday, Carlo, 13 years old, just the two of us in the living room, I realized they had all been leading to a single question. He had been looking at me for a moment with that expression, the one I knew, the one that meant he was about to say something that would stay. He said, "Mama, can I tell you something?" I said, "Of course." He was quiet for a moment, and then, "I've been thinking about our home, about what it could be, spiritually. What it could be if everything we've talked about was truly lived, not just believed, lived." He paused. The room was very still. A home where someone receives Jesus every morning and carries him back. Where confession keeps the interior clean. Where prayer comes from a heart that is truly willing to be changed. Where humility keeps the door open to help. Where the crosses on the walls mean something because the cross is alive inside the people who live there. He said it quietly, almost dreamily, as though he were describing something he could see. By then I understood something I had not understood at the kitchen table, or on the Sunday walk home, or even in the chapel. Carlo had not been giving me scattered insights. He had been leading me, patiently, toward a decision. And then he looked at me directly, with such love, such gentleness, such complete and unhurried certainty. and he said, "Mama, that person can be you." I could not speak. I remember the feeling in my chest. Not pain exactly, but something that felt like a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. Something that felt like being seen completely and loved anyway. Something that felt like being handed a choice. He wasn't asking me to become a mystic. He wasn't asking me to leave my life or transform my personality or achieve some distant spiritual ideal. He was asking me, in the most tender, most personal, most direct way he had ever asked me anything, whether I was willing to be the one person in our home who lived the faith from the inside out, who carried Jesus back from Mass each morning, who kept the interior clean, who prayed from a converted heart, who chose humility over self-sufficiency. He was asking whether I was willing to let the cross move from the wall into my chest. All of those conversations, spread across months and years, each one a stone carefully placed, they had all been leading here, to this moment, to this invitation. Not a rebuke, not a demand, an invitation, extended with the full certainty that I was capable of saying yes. I said yes, not perfectly, not immediately in every detail. The yes I said that evening was the beginning of a long and ongoing process of becoming. There were failures, there were retreats. There are still days when the old habits reassert themselves, when I catch myself managing instead of surrendering, when I realize my prayer has been loud and a little empty and I need to go back to that chapel and sit in the quiet and let the window open. And I knew, even as I said it, that yes was not a feeling. It was a surrender. A surrender I would have to renew on ordinary mornings, in ordinary failures, and in small acts of humility no one would ever see. But the yes was real. And I believe, I know, that Carlo knew it would be. He smiled at me that evening. That smile he had, warm, unperformed, completely at peace. And then he said, almost as an afterthought, "The enemy is afraid of ordinary people who decide to be saints, not the famous ones, the ordinary ones. Because the ordinary ones are everywhere. And if they all decided, really decided, there would be no dark corner left. Ordinary people who decide to be saints. That is what demons fear most, not the cross on the wall, not the holy water by the door, not the rosary beads on the nightstand, a soul that has decided, an ordinary person who said yes and meant it and kept meaning it, day after day, Mass after Mass, confession after confession, prayer after prayer, each one an act of opening the window a little wider. That is what Carlo showed me. That is what he came to give us. Carlo left this world on October 12th, 2006. He was 15 years old. I won't soften that. The absence was real. The mornings without him walking to Mass, the evenings without his folded hands on the kitchen table, all of it hurt in the way that only hurts when someone irreplaceable is gone. Faith does not make loss painless. It makes it bearable, and bearable is not the same as easy. There were still chairs in the house that felt too empty, still mornings that seemed too quiet, still moments when I caught myself listening for his footsteps before remembering I would not hear them again this side of eternity. But it was precisely in the silence of grief that his words came back to me, one by one, with a new weight, as though the pain had stripped away everything that was unnecessary and left only what was true. I remember one afternoon, about a year after he was gone, sitting in that same small chapel where we had talked together. I was not exactly praying. I was simply present, with my grief, with my love, with my still incomplete understanding. And I felt very quietly, very gently, the way you feel warmth when you step from shadow into sunlight. I felt that he was not far, a nearness, a continuation. As though the conversation that had been building across all those years had not ended. It had only changed its form. And I heard, not with my ears, but unmistakably, "That person can be you, Mama." And I understood in that moment that he had not said those words only for me. He said them for you too. Carlo's life, short, extraordinary, completely ordinary, was not a private grace extended to one fortunate family in Milan. It was a message. A living demonstration of what faith actually looks like when it is lived from the inside out. Will you be the one in your home, in your family, in your particular life with its particular struggles? The one who goes to Mass tomorrow morning and carries Jesus back? The one who keeps the interior clean? The one whose prayer comes from a heart that has opened the window? The one who finally, fully, lets their guardian angel walk beside them? I am an ordinary woman. I am not a theologian. I am not a mystic. I am a mother who was given an extraordinary son and who spent years slowly understanding the gift that had been placed in her home. I am still learning. The window is open wider than it was 15 years ago. But there are still corners that need more light. Still mornings when prayer feels more like performance than presence. But I go back. Every time I go back. To Mass. To confession. To that small chapel. To the pew where my son once sat beside me and described prayers that knock and turn away before the door opens. I knock, and I wait, and I do not turn away. That is what he gave me. That is what I hope, with all my heart, that you will take from this. Not information, not a list of spiritual practices, a decision. One quiet, interior, irrevocable decision. To be the one in your home, in your family, in your particular life with its particular beauty and its particular brokenness. Because that is what demons fear most, not the cross on the wall, you. A you that said yes and meant it and keeps meaning it. Carlo believed that about me. I believe it about you. The cross on the wall reminds us of what Christ did, but the cross inside the soul reminds the enemy that Christ is still winning. Go to Mass tomorrow. Go to confession. Open the window and let the cross move from the wall into your soul. He is waiting. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. Carlo Acutis, pray for us.